Hello, everyone. We'll get this going. So it was about a little more than 15 months ago. I was in Jerusalem, and I was making a version of the presentation you're about to see to a Israeli nonprofit land use planning advocacy group called Bimkom. I had just retired from a career in parks planning and policy development, and I decided to travel to Israel to see some family and friends, improve my limited skills in Hebrew, and do some volunteer work. When I first talked with Bimkom about volunteering with them, they looked at my resume and asked, "You always believe in creating more parks, don't you?" I replied that it wasn't necessarily so. They told me of the Israeli government's plan to create a national park in the Negev desert. It would require the displacement and relocation of a number of Bedouin settlements. Bimkom was working with some in the Bedouin community to raise concerns about such a park. I responded that at state parks, we had concerns about the potential impacts on people and cultural resources of any park we might create or alter, and had procedures and criteria for selection of park sites. And then it struck me that a park we recently created might just have relevance for Bimkom. They agreed to bring me on as a volunteer. And what follows tonight is something that came out of my volunteer gig in Israel. Now, in August 2020, we're in the midst of a global pandemic. But I want all of you watching and listening from the comfort of your homes to imagine that you are Bimkom employees, pre-pandemic, surrounded by your colleagues, Israeli Jews, secular Israelis, and Arab Israelis. You are sitting in a small office conference room in the German quarter of Jerusalem on Emek Rephaim Street and are wondering, what can this American from far, far away say that has any meaning for the struggles we face in finding land use planning justice for those with little power in Israel? So please, if you could give me your attention with a critical yet open mind, let's see if there are any valuable insights to be gleaned. This is a story about how two small islands adjacent to yet another small island came to become the first co-managed and co-owned state park and Indian tribal preserve in the United States. Let's first orient you to where this property is located. Washington State is in the very northwest corner of the continental United States. British Columbia is the most southwest province of Canada. About 200 kilometers east of the Pacific Ocean lies an inland sea that crosses the international border between those two countries. It has recently been formally named by the geographical offices of both countries as the Salish Sea. This is a name that is rapidly becoming a popular term locally. It is named for an Indian linguistic group, Salish, that was common throughout the inland waters and, of course, predates the creation of the two countries. Like many things tribal in the early 21st century, the Salish tongue is coming back to prominence in this area. In the middle of the north-south axis of the Salish Sea lies Flagstaff, Kikit, and Fidalgo Islands. Eventually, that which will become the Kukutali Preserve will be made up of all of Kikit, all of Flagstaff, and a bit of Fidalgo. But let's go on with geologic context before diving into the specific site. Like many great Washington State geologic stories, let's start with ice. About 11,000 years ago, during the last ice age, all of Canada and Alaska and portions of the northern tip of the continental United States was covered in a thick layer of ice. How thick? Probably the lower end was close to 1,000 meters thick, and as you went farther north, it thickened considerably. Here you can see that a giant lobe of ice stretched down into what would become the Salish Sea. And as the Ice Age ended and the ice retreated further and further north, it gouged out the softer soils underneath and moved around the harder and larger rock faces. This left one of the world's great archipelagos in what would become parts of Washington State and British Columbia. The isle-dotted Salish Sea is inarguably one of the most beautiful spots on Earth, containing rare vegetative communities and unique animal habitat. Spectacular views of water and mountains. Here is the famous American bald eagle, which hunts for fish in the sea and nests on the large trees found on its many small islands. And here are the orca whales, which reside year-round in the Salish Sea, but are now threatened with extinction as the main food source, salmon, is becoming more and more rare. And all along the tidal area of the Salish Sea for thousands of years, the native Salish people gathered shellfish and kelp and other marine life for food. They harvested cattails for clothing, furnishings, and shelter. In general, the Salish tribal people lived in small villages, many carrying out semi-nomadic lifestyles, like the Bedouin, trading and seeking food and supplies up and down the sea. They were relatively wealthy and usually at peace with each other. However, from time to time, they had to cope with northern, more aggressive tribes coming in, warring on them, killing the men, taking the women for their own, and then leaving the area only to return at some unknown time in the future. In the early 19th century, there began to be increasing conflict between the Salish tribes and non-Indian merchants and settlers. These non-Indians were mostly Europeans. There was one vital part of the geography of the Kukutali site we need to touch on here before continuing on to the legal and cultural history of the site. Note that tiny Flagstaff Island to the left is connected to Kikit Island by a narrow stretch of land. This is a sandy area which at high tides and windy weather is covered by the Salish Sea, but for the most of the year and most of each day, it's high and dry land. Here's that same narrow sandy area between Kikit Island and Fidalgo Island, though note in this case that the area has received fill for a roadbed. These geologic areas are called tombolos. So even though you're all muted, I want you to say the word tombolo. Israelis might call one of these a gesher tsar ma'od. This is an in-joke for Israelis, which means a very narrow bridge, and it's also a key part of a big hit Israeli popular song. They laughed. I'm clearly reaching for symbolism, so I'll leave it there, but try to remember the tombolo. It is a key to this story. Tombolos are in many places in the Salish Sea and are remnants of the Ice Age. As non-Indians migrated in ever-increasing numbers to the Salish Sea region, the military, economic, and political power of these new settlers increased. Tensions rose and small wars broke out in many places between Indians and non-Indians. Indian lifestyles were threatened. It was under these dynamics that the United States authorities negotiated, tribes would say imposed, a series of treaties between the US government and various Indian tribes. The treaties specified reservation boundaries, but they also recognized that tribal members had lifestyles that went well beyond any specific site. Hunting and fishing and gathering of roots and berries ranged widely across the landscape. So the treaties allowed for that to continue. And look on the slide, you'll read that. One of these treaties was called the Treaty of Point Elliott. This treaty, among other treaties and other acts, created the Swinomish Indian Reservation. Most Swinomish tribal members moved onto reservation lands after the signing of the Point Elliott Treaty in 1855. Kickin and Flagstaff Islands are entirely within the Swinomish Indian Reservation. In 1855, there was no such thing as separate ownership parcels or lots of reservation land. The US government held ownership in all the land on the reservation, quote unquote, in trust for the entire Swinomish tribe. Over the next 100+ years, land ownership patterns on reservations and legal authority for land ownership would change frequently. After agreeing to the treaties, the US Congress over the decades passed a number of laws whose intended purpose was to integrate individual Indians' lives with those of other people in the country. These have been known collectively as the Dawes Acts, with their amendments and successors. The effects were multiple: encouraging Indians to leave reservations, dividing tribal land into smaller, privately owned parcels, allowing the selling off of Indian-owned parcels to non-Indians, resulting in much non-Indian ownership of reservation land. The political arguments of these series of laws were often between those in Congress who wanted to eventually eliminate reservations entirely and merge Indians into the greater society. For some, they call that abrogating treaties. And those who saw the continued need to provide a paternal hand over an immature people, thus maintaining the quote-unquote trust relationship. On the screen, you'll see various acts, and you get a sense of what happened in each of those acts. I won't go into details now. So now let's turn our attention back to the property that would eventually become the Kukutali Preserve. Remember that the 1855 Treaty of Point Elliott created the Swinomish Reservation and other reservations, and that all land was owned by the US government in trust to the tribe as a whole. After the Dawes Acts made it possible, the Kukutali site was parceled out in 1906 to tribal families. And then sometime in the next 20 years, it's not clear when, a family heir sold the property to a non-Indian. And what the Swinomish have been saying is that this heir was a 3-year-old girl who was told to sign a paper with her fingerprint, and then was given a lollipop and not much more for it, patted on her head and thanked. In other words, they believed the land was stolen. Through the succeeding years under private ownership, there was varying quality of the relationships between these private owners and the tribe. A Seattle area business family, the Dunlaps, purchased the Kukutali site in the 1950s and turned it into a family retreat. They brought electricity to the island and improved the main access road. They built a large house designed by a locally renowned architect, which had a pool, tennis court, and other amenities. They generally had good relations with the tribe, as they permitted tribal members to carry out traditional practices like seafood harvesting and cattail gathering on the property. A huge change to the site was to occur through the purchase of the property in 1969 by 2 local electrical public utilities, Seattle City Light and the Swinomish PUD. Their goal was to construct a nuclear power plant on Kikit Island. Instead of the then standard design of having large and tall cooling towers, they were going to innovate by using the Salish Sea as a heat sink, thereby providing an abundant opportunity for people to swim and fish to stay warm. They actually said. The utilities spent several years doing required environmental analysis and research. The local communities, including the Swinomish Tribe, organized major opposition just exactly as the US environmental awareness movement was taking off. And within a few years, the proposal was given up by the utilities. During the 1970s, while this was occurring, a series of caretakers lived on the island in the Dunlap's old home. Personal relationships between the Swinomish tribal members and the caretakers was generally seen as cordial, especially after the utilities gave up that nuclear power plant. After finally deciding to dispose of the property, utilities put out for purchase, and many wealthy folks came to look to see if they wanted to buy their own island. Finally, it was purchased by Wally Updike, the owner of a major winery in Washington State and K2 Skis. What happened on and about the island in the next few years became the stuff of television drama. Wealth, celebrity, marital conflict, jealousy, fame, infamy, and murder. It was all here on the island. Wally's son-in-law, Mark Stover, eventually moved to the island with his wife, Wally's daughter. He opened up a dog training center on Kikut Island and became the dog whisperer and the dog trainer to the stars. Howard Schultz, Eddie Vedder, Ichiro Suzuki are just a few of the famous clients. Later, when Wally wanted to sell the island, Stover threatened to sue him. Stover became a frightening face on the island when state parks officials came to explore it for sale, brandishing a gun at the bureaucrats and telling them to leave. Eventually, Stover was murdered by his ex-wife's boyfriend with a trial that became a TV spectacle. I could go into more detail, but let's move on. So Wally Updike contacted the parks in 1989. We started to do an evaluation, the parks did. The tribe didn't hear about it except indirectly that we were considering this, asked what's going on, and before we responded to them, Mrs. Updike found out that the sale might happen, and she said no, and the whole thing just died. Oops. Updike will try again to sell to state parks 20 years later, and that will eventually be successful. But let's briefly talk about what the classic process of land acquisition normally is with state parks. And this goes back to what Bimkom was looking at before about when we acquire things. We looked at the mission and relationship to the site. We developed criteria for when it's suitable to acquire land for parks. We looked at recreation opportunities, scenic values, ease and likely demand for access, and we looked at how constrained it was to be able to develop and other factors. If the evaluation of the site proved that it was desirable for acquisition, then the state still needs to come to terms with the seller and find money to purchase the property. So sometimes state didn't have money right away. We often would contract with third parties, and what happened here is the Trust for Public Land would be the one in this situation to help us have bridge financing. We try to secure a purchase and sale agreement, and then we would finalize and seek funding from the state legislature and other sources. So let's see here. So when we were trying to do this in 2009, park staff had no knowledge that we had previously 20 years ago had been contacted by Wally. But Wally was now divorced, didn't need the help and support of his ex-wife. And Wally was willing to play by the rules. The rules were now closer to $14 million it cost, not $1.4 million what he purchased it for. The site was a highly desirable one. Trust for Public Land was willing to help us buy it. Both Parks and Trust for Public Land began exploring funding sources, finding that there were many sources of funds available for this acquisition because it was just a beautiful, highly valuable natural resource site. Of course, once again, nobody bothered to talk to the tribe about this. This is on the reservation. And they became, when they found out indirectly, unhappy that once again it wasn't brought in, they weren't brought in. There was an issue of mistrust there with the tribes. It was building. Once the tribe was finally engaged in discussion, Parks, Updike, TPL, they all looked at each other and looked at their interests and began to realize, uh-oh, there may be a problem. So the site met the state parks criteria. Trust for Public Land said, okay, this might work. We might get our money back. The private owner was ready to sell, but the tribe said they needed to have permanent access for tribal members, preservation of natural resources, exclusive use of the tribal resources, and no loss of existing rights. And that seemed possible. Remember the map? And remember the tombolo. This particular tombolo right here. It was the tribe's position that while the upland of Kikit and Flagstaff Islands and a portion of Fidalgo Island was owned by Wally Updike, or at least he had title to it, the intertidal area was never separated from the US government ownership that was in trust for the tribe. Further, the tombolos were part of the intertidal area and thus owned by the US in trust for the tribe. Further still, the fill that was placed on the eastern tombolo was done illegally, and the tribe would have authority to remove it and limit access across it. When the state and TPL at Updike heard this, there was great controversy as what to do. Some parks and TPL staff believed the tribe to be incorrect and the sale should move forward and the state should fight the tribe in court if it challenged access. Others thought the legal risk was too great. Still others thought the tribe was probably right. Now the tribe actually wanted state parks to purchase the site. It would guarantee that all tribal members could gain access forever to an important part of their reservation for traditional cultural practices. And generally the tribe saw park use as more compatible with its interests than private residential use and development. So the tribe offered a 25-year lease of the tombolo. The state said no. The tribe offered a 50-year lease. The state said, I'm sorry, but we can't do that. Our funders would not allow it. The State Parks Commission was prepared to vote against the purchase of Kikit Island with a meeting scheduled in a couple weeks to do that. It isn't 100% clear to the participants in the acquisition process, but at least someone from the tribe suggested that when tribal staff and elected officials met alone to discuss the issue, the tribal chair, Brian Kledusby, said in an offhanded manner, you know, if we both own the property, I bet we can make this work because we wouldn't then be giving any rights away. That idea got back to state park staff. Or maybe it was the case of two people coming up with the same idea at the same time, because there was some state park staff thought that Larry Fairley, an assistant director, had thought the same thing. But immediately Larry went online when he heard the tribe was interested in this and Googled the idea of co-management. And he found an example between the federal government of Canada and the Haida tribe in an area that used to be called the Queen Charlotte Islands, but is now called Haida Gwaii. And coincidentally, the Haida tribe is the same tribe I referenced earlier as occasionally making raiding runs on the more domestic-oriented Salish peoples during the pre-European contact times. So Larry Fairley found that when looking at the Haida Gwaii Canon Agreement, that its basic approach could work regarding Kikit and adjacent lands. He proposed a negotiation retreat between parks and tribal staff to see if negotiations could be fruitful, and Chairman Kledusby accepted that offer. State park staff told its park commission that they thought there might be a possibility of working on an agreement. The commission said, okay, give it a shot. So in an all-day retreat at a third-party retreat center, the staff from both entities met to see whether co-management might work. In the beginning, there was tension. The tribal staff had so much negative experience with state officials that they were suspicious. The group went over the Haida Gwaii Canada Agreement, talked through ideas one by one, and as they did so, they kept finding common values and common interests. They both were interested in really low intensity uses. They were both looking at how they could preserve this for the long run. But there was also some difficulties and differences they had to work out. They agreed overall, though, that they thought it could work, and they agreed to draft up an agreement and work towards signatures in short order. They identified all the absolutely critical issues of co-management. They decided that an interim management plan would need to be adopted at the same time as the ownership agreements. Within 4 months, the agreements had been drafted and agreed upon by all parties, including as necessary the private transaction between Parks and Wally Updeck. And the co-management agreement became a reality in June 2010. It created a 6-member board that required consensus to make decisions. The board developed a master plan for the preserve, including a phasing plan. In the end, there was consensus on just about every significant issue. One Parks board member wanted to channel use to Flagstaff Island and not completely prohibit it. He lost that argument for now, but it was a conversation about strategy for resource protection, not values. Another issue was the number of spaces and design of the parking lot. The parking lot for some is now operating, some optimally, but it isn't seen by anyone as a severe problem. And that was it. Otherwise, all board members expressed joy in the products of their labors and thanks for both governments' good efforts and intentions. Here's a phasing plan in table form about how we would actually develop this, including 50-50 sharing for the capital improvements of the preserve and park between the tribe and state parks. Kukutali is part of a group of islands managed by state parks, so it was efficient to add that to management. And here's a series of you can see the outlines on the plan of what kind of improvements would occur at Kukutali. What are the outcomes of co-management? It improved tribal and state relations. It actually improved the cultural and natural resource protections for the site. You remember that big house that the Dunlaps had? That's been removed. If the tribe wasn't part of this and demanded removal, it's possible that building would still be there at a financial drain on the state. But when worked out, said, let's remove that. We got more financial investment than the state could have done by itself. The tribe really came through, and in fact, they put the first capital investments into this. And both for the tribe and all the public, future generations were assured of access forever. Why was this successful? Oops. So screen sharing paused. I don't know what happened here. Do you still see the screen? Hold on. Pardon me, for whatever reason, oh, hold on. But I can't. Okay, 1 second here. All right, I'll go through it here. So the reasons for success. There were no good options. This would have, without co-management, you couldn't, and you guys, you're able to see, Seth, you're able to see the screen fully?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, sorry. I can't, but I'll work through it. So there weren't any really good options. If we didn't have co-management, the state could not have allowed for, they could not have spent the millions of dollars it would have taken to purchase the property and have that, and not be able to guarantee access, public access forever. There was also a willingness to give up exclusive powers. The tendencies in bureaucracies in any groups is to have full control. And there were really some creative people and far-sighted people on both sides who are willing to say, I don't have to control everything to see if I can still get almost all of what we actually need. In this situation, there was also shared values. This wasn't a question of it being difficult to reach common direction for the park and the preserve. There was broad agreement. There were compatible legal structures on how we would arrange this stuff and how we would guarantee the assurance that the agreement would stick. There were high levels of leadership commitments. Those people who could make commitments and follow through were committed. And finally, the structure that was put together provided an incentive to maintain investment. There was in the agreement itself, if either party didn't make the investment, the other party could kill the deal. There's also some wonderful examples of successful co-management efforts in parks and special lands throughout the world. Bimkom was very interested in that. There's also examples that have had some problems. At this point in the presentation to Bimkom in Jerusalem, I described my intention for continuing on with the insights at Kukutali and developing more detailed analysis of the advantages and challenges of co-management. I wanted to develop strategies for optimizing the chances for co-management success. It remains a challenge for me to take this project on to its fulfillment. You know, perhaps the humiliation of presenting to 55 people an incomplete work before my family and friends and colleagues in my community is yet another incentive for me to actually finish this. But for now, this evening, it is time for me to say to you, my Israeli colleagues, Toda Rabah, thank you very much for your attention. And now let's open this up for questions or insights you might have. Rabbi Seth, as you have been following the chat room, there might be questions unanswered, or perhaps you can help guide a few of us in the questions and answers if people are up for that.
Sure. So should I stop the screen share, Daniel? Is that so we can?
Yeah, why don't you stop the screen share? We can always bring it back if people have questions.
Okay, so we can do that. And I'll keep you spotlighted though, because I know that folks might not want to be in the recording, but you can see each other. So, well, there are a couple ones in the chat already, but maybe I'll just go with not necessarily in order of the that they were given, but maybe in order of difficulty. I don't know. So so could you just tell us about your role? One of the questions is, what role did you play? Well, what role did you play at state parks, and what role did you play in this particular project?
Sure. Well, I played a lot of different roles at state parks. I was for most of my career, I was a planner. I planned parks. But I think most relevant for this particular presentation is I was also, for a few years, the tribal liaison. So I was the connection. I represented the agency to the 29 federally recognized tribes in Washington State. I also, at the time the Kukutali was being developed in 2010, I was the capital program manager for the region, Northwest region. And so I was involved with doing plans, but also in doing capital developments up in the Northwest region.
Great, thank you. So could you say a bit more about, this came up from Anjali, about the, how the land was originally taken, or a bit more about the treaties? And I mean, you mentioned the story about the young girl being told to sign over the land. So you talk a bit more about how the land was taken originally from the tribes, maybe from a tribal perspective.
Yeah, just sort of to summarize it, and we don't know all the details of this stuff, but when the entire reservation, there wasn't the ability to parcel the land out initially. And then it transitioned to allow only tribal members, enrolled members, to have portions of the land. And that was a time in the 19th century where they were trying to have tribes be more like the non-tribal culture with farms and ownership and And then that proceeded even further when they began to allow these parcels to be sold by tribal members to non-tribal members. And it was around this time that there was a lot of, all around the country at this time, there was a lot of these sales, and the power imbalance and between the tribes and the non-tribal members, and ended up where the tribes lost a lot of control of their own reservations.
Mm-hmm.
And then when whatever family individually then owned this property, began to have private sale after private sale moving forward. And then you saw all the different possibilities that occurred on that property, including the construction of homes, all the way to the potential for a nuclear power plant.
Yeah, as was put in the chat by someone, that's almost a legal genocide is the term that was used in terms of breaking up the tribes through those quote unquote legal means, I guess, too.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
Interesting. Can you say more about the Centennial Accord? And the question is, when, where, and how did the Centennial Accord influence the process? Who has jurisdiction in the reserve?
So the Centennial Accord essentially is a process document. Centennial Accord was done in 1989. And for the most part, what it says is that the state should have regular conversations with the tribes and to hear what issues the tribes have. Those relations are government to government relations. So there's a respect as a mutual, it's essentially a separate sovereign government. The state is recognizing the sovereignty of the tribe. So you have on one piece of property two sovereignties that can sometimes happen. Two rules that can sometimes happen. It can be confusing. And so how do these two governments, the state and the federal government and the tribal government, how do they interact around each of their sovereignties, or their sense of ownership and response and jurisdiction, I should say. So that set up some expectations for communication. The Centennial Plan, there was a further extension of the Centennial Plan in terms of some of this process, which established ongoing relationships between the individual agencies like state parks and other ones, and furthermore things which began to happen in terms of notifications. So anytime, for instance, the governor passed an executive order, anytime that any capital improvement occurred on state land, you must notify all tribes of jurisdiction and give them a chance to dialogue with you about that. So that's it. It was not around selling. It was selling the property was not around the authority to buy or sell land.
Great, thank you. We'll get to some other questions, but just to note that for folks following along, appreciating the conversation that's ongoing in the chat as well about again, sort of going back, I guess, to some of these initial, land grabs as well, away from the tribes. And as was just put in by an important legal piece, that Congress reconsidered all this tribal destruction philosophy represented by the Allotment Acts in the 1930s, a reverse policy.
That's right.
In 32, started reconsolidating the reservation. So all of that, I'm struck by that term, legal genocide, as was there in terms of we know about the actual genocide that happened with Native Americans and now the legal about the taking of the land.
One of the quote unquote process aspects of this, in terms of the Centennial Plan and other stuff, is that there is a training on tribal relations and tribal legal authority that was mandated for those folks, those state employees who were working with the tribe. So I went through some of that training. My brain is, the distance of time is maybe forgetting some of this stuff, but that was an important part for us to understand the authority the tribes had and to deal and work with the tribe with respect to the authority that they did have.
So another question that come up, I guess, getting to the original framing of this in terms of your work at Bimkom, and that they were dealing with this issue about the Israeli government wanting to create a park in the Negev. What ultimately was the reception of the presentation, and how did it might affect the decision around that?
Yeah. So this is, I mean, so it is naive in the extreme to compare the capability for the state and Indian tribes here to begin to repair the breaches compared to the extraordinary difficulties happening right now in Israel and Palestine and the Middle East. And one of the key differences is the power relationships, where the Indian tribes in our country are finding and gaining in their own awareness and capability of their power, and the power of some of these the peoples in Israel and Palestine are that they don't feel powerful. They aren't in reality have much power, and so there was conversations about that. We had a lot of conversations about that. In fact, some of the most valuable things that the Bimkom people said that they got from my presence was just our lunch conversations about their experiences and our experiences and the differences and similarities with that. There was another example where Bimkom, where there was the creation, the Israeli government wanted to create a park in East Jerusalem, and there was no criteria for creating the park. They just wanted to create the park, and Bimkom said the reason they wanted to create the park is they wanted to limit Arab settlements. They just wanted to limit population, and so parks were used as a strategy in a larger Israeli-Arab conflict. Mm. So these were what was the most valuable, sort of these conversations that we had and insights about the differences and similarities.
Mm. I'll get to the chat of the question, but just as a follow-up for myself, did they see this as a potential model, or are they just, I mean, how did they receive it within Bimkom in terms of the work that they do?
So that's a really good question. What they were interested in is they were interested in a set of international examples of co-management. And I mentioned, I referenced a few of those ones. We're familiar with the Eby's Landing National Historic Preserve, and there's some things in the British National Parks model that deals with co-management. But they were very interested in how co-management works around the world, because they saw that as a leverage with the Israeli government, saying, look, other places do this. This is a legitimate issue. So, for example, the Bedouin, the Bedouin settlements in the Negev, there's a perfect example of that in Jordan with Wadi Rum. And Wadi Rum is famous as the scene of Lawrence of Arabia and Star Wars and all these things. But there's 1,000 Bedouin who live in the national park that is Wadi Rum, and they're allowed to move around and have and live their lifestyle. So they were looking for lots of different examples because they thought it might give them leverage.
Great. So I see another question. I mean, again, I'm just, if folks aren't following, it's a wonderful, just a less questions, but conversation in the chat, especially from folks who have indigenous backgrounds and sort of relationship to some of this history. So I appreciate folks sharing in the chat. One question, I guess, that comes to this, again, going back to the process question, is who was representing the states in this, and how is it to work in a consensus model? It sounded like you were working in a consensus model. And so
that's a really good question. So in the negotiations, it's a very important question about who's in the room negotiating. And because tribal state relations can be fraught, can be very tender, that it's important to have equal levels within an organization negotiating. So we made sure that when we talked to the tribal chair, we had our director talk to the tribal chair. And when we appointed who would be part of the negotiating team, you had people of equal and equivalent kind of levels within the organization do that. If we had a lawyer there, they had a lawyer there. If we had assistant director, they had assistant director. So that was worked out in that fashion.
And things were decided on consensus. That was a model that was built in. Is that?
That's right. That's right. And the development of the agreement was by consensus, and the agreement in the management plan and in the agreement to the sort of the legal agreement on the land that makes it a co-management agreement requires a consensus of opinion on any major decisions. And if the board, the 6-member board, can't reach a consensus, they report that to their higher ups, including the tribal chair and the tribal council, as well as the director and Parks Commission. And there's some possibility of working things out there, but it has to be mutually agreed upon.
Mm. And what I know that you're presenting as from your perspective of working at state parks and sort of the work you do with Bimkom. Could you share what's the tribe's perspective on this work and the co-management plan?
Yeah, let me share a little bit of both. One of the things the tribe, I talked to all the tribal negotiators on this, as well as all the state parks negotiators as part of this process. The tribal negotiators was interesting. They said, yeah, all the state parks folks believe this was the highlight of their professional careers. The tribal folks said of themselves, we were just very pleasantly surprised at how open the state officials were to hearing us out and meeting our needs. And they felt really good about the quality of the outcome. The tribal members felt very good. Essentially, they feel like they got everything they wanted. And I think that's probably a fair thing, that if there was any compromises per se that were done, it was done on the state side. When there was any controversy. But the tribe did, to a certain degree, the tribe, there was a big give that the tribe made, which was to allow the public fully on there at all. Because they could have been in the driver's seat with the tombolo and saying, no, we're going to cut access. And rather than having legal challenges on that, they said, no, let's keep this open for us. And they did. And so the tribe won such things as the only legal shellfish harvesting are by tribal members. The state said, we will not let the public do shellfish harvesting. There were a few other things like that.
Well, we shouldn't be shellfish harvesting anyway because of, it's not kosher.
Yeah, the Jewish content of the negotiating team was, I may surprise you, was non-existent.
So a couple other questions have popped up. One is, was the experience or the partnership between the Navajo Nation and the federal government instructive in this and pursuing the part, or is it Canyon de Che? Instructive at all, or is that part of
that issue had not come up? The only one that became the model for it was this Hanagwai with the Canadian tribe and the Canadian federal government. That was the model, and they worked off that model.
Yeah. And getting to the park, a question came up about the funding of the park, and I guess I'll expand that question myself. I'm curious to learn more about the park itself. I mean, you showed us that map. There looked to be restrooms. What's the status of the park right now?
It's a nature reserve. There's very little development. There's a small 6-car parking lot up by a road adjacent to a county road. That parking lot, you go. There's a vault toilet there, a 1-hole vault toilet at the parking lot, and a interpretive sign and an entry sign at the parking lot. And then you take a long walk down to across that tombolo onto the island. There's a one main sort of, was the main road before, but it's still sort of the main access but it's only allowed, the cars are only allowed for administrative purposes. There's a few lovely trails. There is some interpretive signs. All other development has been removed from the island, and there still is a grassy area that's mowed. There's a few picnic tables there. but nothing more than that. And it's essentially a reserve for people to walk on, relax, look at the views, and leave. Day use only.
And the funding?
Thank you. The funding was, so it was $14 million to acquire it. About half of that was actually federal funds. A good portion of it was state funds. And then we got specific grants from other sources, including some private sources that made up the difference for capital. I mean, for acquisition. For capital improvements, it was 50-50, the tribe and the state. My numbers on this are probably the whole thing for capital was probably about $4 million, of which the tribe did a lot of it, which was to remove the removal of that house, the restoration of a lot of the areas, and then the state built the parking lots and a few other things. But that was the cost. And it came for the state. It came from state capital budget.
And I'm assuming that if we Google it, we could find that salacious murder and mayhem story.
Oh yeah, dog whisperers. It was, and you could go online and YouTube and see the story of it with Dateline. It was on Dateline. If you know that show.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Daniel, thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to stop the recording for folks and sort of take us out of spotlight and sort of show everybody again, so we could, if there are any other follow-up questions. But I just want to offer a great. Oh, one more question just came in before I do that. So, were the tribes able to rid the island of non-native vegetation? So is that
one of the not fully? There's some grass that still remains in that area, and the tribe was okay with that. The grass isn't going to spread. That kind of grass wasn't invasive, and the tribe was okay because it's a gathering area for the tribal members as well. Otherwise, very little invasive species. Yeah, really, it was in very pristine condition in that sense. It wasn't old growth forest, but it had very, very little use. So you didn't have English ivy infestations, blackberry infestations, a very intact community, both upland and the intertidal.
Yeah. And this is a unique situation, right? A question just came in. There are other co-management agreements between state parks and other tribes?
No, this is unique, but state parks is working to develop some. There is a Nisqually. There's a state park that's been called Nisqually State Park on the Nisqually River, and the state parks have been working closely with the Nisqually tribe in the planning of that park, and this goal would be to have some co-management or at least some shared in the capital improvements of the park, but that has not happened yet.
And
actually, I take that back. What am I saying? It did happen. Just a very little bit. It had an initial trail system, and it had at Nisqually day use only, a little trail system and a trailhead, and it was shared costs between the Nisqually tribe and state parks. So there's another example.
Was there is there other examples in the country, or has Washington State Parks consulted with other places? Is this of interest in other places in the country, or what?
I did some checking on that, including contacting National Park Service. At the time, I believe it was the first and it's the only co-managed state park and tribal preserve as a whole.
And is there a possibility in this one, again, coming from the chat, that the Swinomish would ultimately reclaim the sole ownership and manage it on their own? Is that?
There is a possibility, and the possibility is if the state parks messes up and doesn't fulfill its part of the bargain, and that is actually relatively controversial. I sort of read the entire agreement, and I said, "You mean if we don't pay for, keep doing this, they could get it?" And it would not be easy. It would be challengeable in a practical sense, because I talked about being the incentive system. I don't expect it to happen, but it's possible. It's possible that they could take it over entirely. They would have to spend a lot of money in doing it.
Yeah.
But as the tribe's own resources gets more and more capabilities, it's very possible that if they went to the federal government and went to the state and said, we'll give you a boatload of money for this, maybe that would happen in the future.
Yeah. Interesting.
I doubt it would happen, because essentially the tribe's getting just about everything it wants right now.
Interesting. Well, again, Daniel, thank you so much for agreeing to do the presentation, especially with the little last minute ask. But again, when I heard this talk, I was very compelled by it. I think both because of the story in and of itself, but also in the context in which you were presenting it to this Israeli nonprofit who is specifically looking for ways of advocating for unenfranchised groups in Israel around land use issues. And so it's very interesting to hear both, right, the presentation and the context of the presentation, and sort of those two different levels of it. So, so wonderful. So I'm going to stop the recording and sort of open it up again, and we can, I guess, schmooze a little bit. And just on behalf of everyone, I say thank you, Daniel.